Hello, this is Jennifer. Lately I've been sharing several videos of using watercolor with stamping. I have another for you today, but it's a little bit different. I have some different things to share. I will be focusing on Peerless Watercolor and showing you a new storage system that I'm using for it. But before I show you that system, let's take a look at the card we'll be creating also. You can see there's watercolor in the owl and also in the background. There's a nice pearly shine to it that's really easy to achieve. And also the white around the owl, the white outline is actually flat, and it really gives a nice contrast to the watercolor. So I'll show you how to do that too. Let's first talk about Peerless Watercolor. It's very unique. I have done an in-depth video on this form of watercolor, which I'll link to here and in my YouTube description below. Now, since this watercolor is a little bit different, storage can be kind of tricky. This Peerless Watercolor comes in these sheets that contain the pigment, and you just take your wet brush and touch it to the paper to pick up the bright pigment. And it's just a great watercolor, very intense, and when it comes together with the water, it kind of does all the work of watercoloring for you. Now, these sheets I have shared in the past in that video, which I'm linking to, a way that I stored them. I'll show you again in a moment. But a lot of people were saying they didn't like cutting it up into little pieces. So I got this information from my friend Joanne, who showed me how she stored her Peerless Watercolor, and I loved it. So I am going to show you this system. This is just a 4x6 photo album, very inexpensive. I'll link to the one that I used. I put watercolor paper into the photo sleeves where I have samples of each color watercolored on there, so I know what it'll look like. I've labeled it with my label maker, but you could handwrite it in there if you want to. And I actually have the entire piece of Peerless Watercolor just stuck to the front of these photo sleeves. So I can just touch right to it with my water, and then I can close up my book, and all it does is touch the plastic sleeve that's in front of it. So this is an incredible system, and I thank Joanne for sharing this with me. I like that this is neat and tidy and compact, and I didn't have to cut up the sheets of the Peerless Watercolor. You'll see how I use these watercolors in a few moments when we do the card. So the pieces that you see in here of the watercolor, it looks like they're about 2.5 by 2.5 roughly. These are all from the bonus pack of Peerless Watercolor, which happens to be my favorite. You get the most colors in there, and you really don't need bigger pieces of the Peerless Watercolor because these little squares last for a long time. I use these a lot, and you can still see that there's a lot of color, a lot of pigment in these little pieces. So you'll see how these work in a moment. I just wanted to show you this other option for storing them. Now, the original way that I stored my Peerless Watercolor, which I still use, is this system with these little pockets that I cut up the little pieces and slid them into. I will link to a video that shows this system in case this is something that you think might work better for you. I just wanted to show you the new option. Okay, so now let's go ahead and dive into our cards and actually use these Peerless Watercolors. I'm using this owl stamp set on the right from Jane's Doodles. I was actually going to also use this flower stamp on the left. I think this is a fantastic set that would be perfect for using watercolors. So in case you're not an owl person, you could always grab that flower stamp set too. I really like it, and I'll be using it soon in a video also. So to stamp the owl, I'm using Versamark ink, just a clear sticky ink, and I'm stamping this onto the smooth side of some Tim Holtz watercolor paper. That's my favorite of all the watercolor papers. And then I am going to white heat emboss this. Now, for this technique, you could totally use clear embossing powder. In fact, I would probably recommend clear embossing powder because when we iron it off later, you'll see why. So just stick around and you'll see why I suggest the clear. But I went ahead and used white here. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. Now, when I work with watercolor, I like to tape my piece flat onto a cutting board. This way I can pick it up and rotate it around without the watercolor moving, the wet watercolor moving when I move it. So this is an excellent solution for me, and I'll link to the cutting board that I use here. I just think it's a great tool to have when you do watercolor. I'm using some painter's tape just to tape around the edges. Now, I didn't really press this down because I plan to trim off the edges afterwards, but you could leave a white frame around the edge of your watercolor by pressing this down really well. It keeps the watercolor from kind of creeping underneath it. So now it's time to start adding the color. Now, there are a billion ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you the easiest. I'm not great at blending a lot of color on my own, so I like to let the water and the color do the work for me. Now, you can't really see the image here, but you'll be able to here in a little bit. What I'm doing is I'm taking a thin brush and adding water just to a few spots where I want to first add color. So I've wet my paper already, just in the few spots I want to add color. Then I wet my brush again and just rubbed it real quickly onto the Peerless green watercolor sheet that you saw there. And you can see how much intense color I pick up. And then I'm just taking my brush and dropping that color into the wet paper, the areas where there's wet paper. If you have too much color, you can soak it up with a paper towel. So I have just put down water and then put down color. So you'll see me do that again here. I'm just wetting an area, and then I'm going to wet my brush and then dip it onto the green Peerless watercolor, which you see over there on the left, which I'm picking up right there. Then I drop the color into the wet areas on the paper. This is a key for me. By wetting the paper first and then dropping the color onto it, I get great blending. Now I'm going back with just a wet brush and kind of just making sure that it fills all these little wings in, or these little feathers in. And then I am going to go ahead and add some pearl shine to this too while it's still nice and wet. Now it doesn't look like this is doing much blending, but it will dry it into a way that looks blended. So what I have here is a mister. Now what is in this mister is just water and then a big scoop of Perfect Pearl pigment powder. I'll link to a video where I show how to create this mix, but it's very easy. You just put Perfect Pearl pigment powder into a bottle with water, as much of the Perfect Pearl as you want to. I did a medium mix here. And you can see up there on the right, you get a pearlized water. It's got this pearl shine to it. And I just put drops of that onto each of the areas that I color. You can't see the pearl in the color right now, but later on when it dries, that Perfect Pearl will kind of sit on top of the paper and you'll get a pearly shine. So let me go ahead and go through this again. I'm just wetting some of these little feathers with water, and then I'm going and picking up a little bit of the blue Peerless watercolor, dropping it into the wet areas, blending it out, and then adding a touch of the Perfect Pearl pearlized water. Very easy to do. Now you'll see me kind of try to do some blending with my brush on my own. I'm telling you, you get better results if you let the water and the watercolor do the work for you. I tend to overwork things, but I promise it's easy. You get better results if you just leave it alone and let it do its own thing. So here I'm wetting my paper, and look at that intense, bright, like bluish purple that you get there. Just great color. Now, if I didn't use the Perfect Pearl pearlized water on top of this, that little drop that I'm adding, this color would stay more intense. By putting this pearlized water in it, that Perfect Pearl is going to kind of sit on top of the paper and kind of soften the color behind it. So if you want intense color, just skip the pearlized water that you're adding on top. Just totally skip that part, and you can end up with really intense watercolor. But I love adding that little bit of pearl to all of the color just to add some shine. You could use Perfect Pearl water, that pearlized water, for all the watercoloring here, but I didn't want to get any of the Perfect Pearls on my Peerless watercolor pieces over to the left. So now I've just gone in and filled in all these little feathers. It did take me about 10 or 15 minutes to do this, but really this is the key part of the card, and I'm not going to spend much time embellishing it, so I didn't mind spending a little time doing those little feathers. You could have done them all one color if you wanted to. Now here on the wing here, these bigger feathers, you'll be able to see these colors blend much better. So I've wet the feathers. Now I'm dropping in some of the green Peerless watercolor here. See how it just starts to blend into the wet paper? Now I've put some green down. Now I'm going to go ahead and add another color. So I'm going and picking up a teal color and dropping on the other side, on the bottom side of these little feathers. And look at how the teal and the green just kind of start blending on their own. Then I'm adding in some quick drops of that Perfect Pearl water, and I'll let that dry, and we'll get like a pearly shine to it when it dries. So let me do a couple more feathers here. This one I'm going to put some teal towards the top of these feathers, and then I'm going to wet my brush and go pick up like a kind of a purplish color here and add that to the bottom of the feathers. And look at how it just starts working its way up through the water. Just kind of let it do its own thing. Here I'm adding in some drops of Perfect Pearl and letting it blend on its own. Now I did the same thing to the other wing over here, and you can see all the colors starting to blend together, and that Perfect Pearl kind of works its way over all of the color and kind of tones it down and leaves that pearly shine. So for like the chest of the owl here, I'm putting green towards the bottom. Then I'm going in and adding some water just to kind of blend it out. Then I am going in with some blue towards the top, and you'll see those just kind of all start to blend together. And then I'll come in with a little bit of Perfect Pearl and drop it on top of all that color to kind of allow that to blend it and leave a pearly shine. Again, the perfect pearl powder, this will soften the color. So if you don't want intense color, or if you do want intense color, just skip the perfect pearls. Now I'm going to show you one last bit here. This is the top here. You can see here a lot of the blending that you can get between colors. So I put some blue down, now I'm putting some teal, and then I'm going to drop in some green, and look at that blending that you get. These Peerless watercolors kind of react a little bit differently than regular watercolors. You get really intense outlines when it dries, like the color kind of leaves a dark outline around it, and the colors kind of blend in a unique way. So in that comparison video, you can see how they blend together and dry in comparison to regular watercolor. You know, I personally like the look of this, but it's totally a preference. I think these are really easy to work with, and the effects that they give are really cool. Okay, so now the last bit for this owl, I put some yellow and brown on his little beak here, and now around the center here, watch how I wet the around the eyes here, and then when I drop in the purple, look at how it just starts to blend on its own. So very easy to do, and I'm going to drop some perfect pearls on top of that to kind of soften it and leave a pearly shine. Now, here's the hard part. You got to leave this to dry. I think it works better if you just let it dry on its own instead of heat setting it. I know it's hard, but I'm promising the results are much better that way. So there you can see, look at that color. It's just beautiful with that pearly shine on it. Now the background is so easy. I'm going in with a wider brush here, added a lot of water to the background, and now I'm going in with a really soft blue and starting to dab color on. Notice that I'm not really brushing it around, I'm kind of just dabbing it in different areas. Then I go pick up more water and just keep moving it around, and you can see it just all starts to blend out on its own. The key to these backgrounds is to wet your paper first, then bring in some color, and then maybe put a little more water on if you want it softer, and it will all blend on its own. You could do more variations of color in the background here. I kind of wanted mine to stay pretty even blue, but you could add different shades of blue. You could add more color to different areas if you want to. But by adding lots of water and just a little bit of color, look at how it just moves on its own, you can quickly get a great sky background. I did wipe away anything that was on the tape just so I didn't end up with a mess. And then again, I'm just going to set that aside to dry. I did also put a little bit of that perfect pearlized water onto that watercolor, so I'll have a little bit of that pearly shine on the background too. So now that this is dried completely, I'm going to go ahead and carefully take off my painter's tape, and there we have our great background. You can see that some of the watercolor kind of just kind of went underneath the painter's tape there in the corner. If I would have pressed that painter's tape down, it wouldn't have done that. And look at that pearly shine that you get on top of that color. Now I decided to go bold on this card and kind of chop off part of the little owl. I promise he doesn't scream. I got this idea from my friend Laura Bass, and she is great at design. And sometimes if you have a big image like this, kind of chopping it off and being real, like creatively chopping it off, just gives a really cool look. You could leave him whole if you wanted to. Now I decided I wanted to keep the sentiment very simple and the rest of the card very simple, in fact. So I have a strip of dark cardstock here that I'm going to add onto a lighter piece of cardstock. I'm going to cut off the extra here. I have a sentiment from another Jane's Doodles stamp set. This sentiment just says "Miss You," and I want to position it right about there, and I will white heat emboss this. So I'm going to stamp it with Versamark ink and then put on some white embossing powder and zap that. I just love the look of a white greeting against a darker background. Okay, now I decided I wanted to make my owl smooth, so I wanted to take away that embossing powder. This is the case where I said using clear powder probably would have been a better idea, but the white seemed to work out okay. Now you can do this on an ironing board, but it's hard to put my video camera above the ironing board. What I'm doing is putting a piece of just clean typing paper on top of my stamped piece, and taking a medium heat setting iron to this, and what's happening is it's melting the powder and transferring it from my workpiece to that scrap paper. So instead of having the raised white area on the owl, I will have a flat area, and it's one of those how did they do that techniques. Now I liked having the embossing powder, that raised embossing image, when I was doing my watercolor, because it kept all the watercolor within the lines, making it so much easier. But here I'm going to remove it so I get that smooth look. And I love how the Peerless Watercolor kind of dries with a dark outline right up against that white. I just think that is so cool. Okay, so now it's time to assemble our piece here. I'm going to go ahead and glue this down with foam tape. And by the way, if this piece looks a little bit different than the one you saw me create a few minutes ago, it's because I messed up that one. I touched it to a baby wipe and it was ruined, so I had to do it again. Anyways, it happens. So now I'm going to add this also with some foam tape onto the front of a white note card. And then I'm going to add little Google eyes on here with some multi-medium. This is a matte glue from Ranger that holds on very well. And now I'm just going to add my little Google eyes, and there we have our finished card. So you could do this with any forms of watercolor. You could skip the pearlized water if you want to. You could skip the iron off embossing if you want to. But I think by using them all together, you get a really cool outline looking owl here with a nice soft background. So if you are interested in these products, I've linked them below to multiple sources. Also go over to my blog because I'll have links to all the videos I've mentioned in this video and links to other projects using these products. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll stop back by again soon.